And then we're going to go live. All right. All right, so we are live on Facebook, and we're just going to give a few minutes to let our audience members come on and join us. Hi to everyone who is already logged on and in here with us. We're just going to let a few more people trickle on in. All right, so hi everyone, welcome to another installation of PHS Live, our monthly webinar series at the Presbyterian Historical Society. We're really happy to have you all joining us, and we're very happy to have our 4 panelists joining us as well tonight. My name is McKenna Britton. I'm the Communications Associate at PHS, and yeah, we have our webinar ready to go. We have our panelists ready to have some great discussions tonight about their research and our research fellowship program. The session's going to run for about an hour, and there will be 10 to 15 minutes towards the end for audience questions if you have any for the panelists. You can drop them in the Q&A feature here on Zoom, in the chat, or if you're watching on Facebook, in the Facebook comment section, and I will be moderating that and checking out those questions. Yeah, we're joined by four past PHS fellows. And before we get to introducing them, I'm going to let Nancy Taylor, our executive director, talk for a few minutes about the Research Fellowship Program, which is what brings us all here today.
Thank you, McKenna, and welcome everyone. I wanted to let you all know that the Presbyterian Historical Society has had a research fellowship program since 2004. And over that time, we have hosted 47 research fellows. Thanks in most part to generous donations from our supporters who have funded that program over the years. We have had fellows every year except for 2021, and that was in large part due to the pandemic. The 4 fellows that were chosen in 2020 found out at the beginning of March of that year, and then they had to postpone their scheduled trips. And we're very glad to have 2 of those folks with us tonight. We are having fellowships awarded in 2023, and the deadline for that is February 3rd. There is information on applying for research fellowships on our website, and I think we will put, either McKenna or I will put that in the chat for people, the link to that page on our website. And I just want to share on behalf of the PHS staff how much we have enjoyed working with the research fellows over the years, helping them find the resources in our collection that can really speak to and enhance their projects. And we've also really enjoyed helping them communicate about their really important work. So I'm looking forward to hearing them, the 4 folks that are joining us today, talk a little bit more about their research at PHS and how that helped their projects. So thank you, everyone. And I'm going to turn it back over to McKenna.
Thank you, Nancy. So we're gonna get right on into this. For the sake of introductions, could each of you share your name, the institution you are affiliated with, and the research topic that brought you to PHS as a fellow? I'm just gonna call on Connor to start us out.
Great, thanks, McKenna. Hi, everyone. My name is Connor Keniston, and I'm a visiting assistant professor of American culture at Randolph College in Lynchburg, Virginia, formerly Randolph-Macon Women's College. And my project is on religion and the radio in the 1930s, 1940s. Yeah, thanks.
All right, let's go to Ruben next.
Thank you very much. My name is Ruben Lothman. I'm a senior lecturer in African history and the School of History in Queen Mary University of London. And I'm researching the American Presbyterian Congo Mission, which ran from 1891 until 1969.
Thank you, Ruben. Dee Dee, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yes, sure. Hi, my name is Sopanit Angsu Singh. I usually go by Didi. I'm currently a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Georgetown University. And right now I'm working on a dissertation on American Mission School in Iraq and their impact on Iraqi students' national, gender, and civic identities from the 1920s to the 1950s.
Awesome, thank you. And last but not least, Paul.
I'm Paul Putz. I'm the Assistant Director of the Faith and Sports Institute at Baylor's Truett Seminary. And my research project, book manuscript, is on sports and Christianity and modern American culture, focusing especially on the meaning of the Christian athlete and how that's been defined and by different organizations over the 20th century.
Awesome. So as you can see, we have a very wide range of topics that are all very intriguing in their own rights. So for our next question, our questions are going to be a little more personalized based on the research fellows projects and what they were looking at when they were here at PHS. So I'm just going to go right back to you, Paul. Our question for you is, your research explored how the Fellowship of Christian Athletes became a powerful bastion for anti-communist sentiment. How did the records of the National Council of Churches reveal that position?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here, and I love the mission of the Historical Society and the way that you allow young scholars like myself to get to do this type of research. So much needed for me to come out from Texas and explore what y'all had. In terms of the anti-communist influence in the NCC records, one of the things or the points that I make in my book manuscript is I trace out how Christian athletes as we know them today, how that originated and how they became a cultural force. And probably in most people's minds, they think of someone like a Tim Tebow, sort of a conservative evangelical. But originally, sort of the heart of Christian engagement with sports culture came from mainline Protestants. and the organization that really came to define what it means to be a Christian athlete, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. They were birthed in the 1950s at the heart and the height of the religious nationalism of "In God We Trust" and the Pledge of Allegiance, and all of these rituals of American piety. And FCA, with mainline Protestants at the fore, became a force for mobilizing Christian athletes to try to get them to present to young Americans a vision of what it means to be a good American citizen, which included this idea of faith in God. So the National Council of Churches in those records show and they highlight the way that different bodies within the NCC, including the University Christian Mission and some other organizations, actually collaborated with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes early on. There was a shared sense of mission, an attempt to really articulate a form of evangelism, but also social responsibility, which sort of fit with what mainline Protestants were going for in the 1950s. And from its very beginnings too, the records that I was able to find with the National Council of Churches showed me that there was an attempt to distance the Fellowship of Christian Athletes from some of the more evangelical expressions of Christianity that were flourishing at the time. So instead of Billy Graham, who was sort of the head of what it meant to be an evangelical, mainline Protestants in the NCC wanted to present a more respectable form of evangelism and engagement. And so the records at the NCC that I saw showed me those dynamics. They showed letters being sent back and forth. There was actually an NCC council member who attended a Fellowship of Christian Athletes rally, and I was able to see the documents where he's sending back his thoughts and opinions and sharing that he thinks this is something that the NCC can get behind. So they really helped me strengthen and a core piece of my argument, which again was centered on this idea of mainline Protestant engagement with sports, how it's tying in with a sense of American identity, yes, an anti-communism, but an attempt to have more of a religious pluralistic, at least friendly to religious pluralism approach to anti-communism, one that wanted to create room for other religious and theological perspectives, and one that didn't want to be narrowly tied to, say, an evangelical understanding of what it means to be a Christian.
The second half of my question is about the traits of the ideal Christian athlete. And when I was looking through your initial application, and I was trying to put a face to like what kind of athlete this was, I don't know how I didn't even think of Tim Tebow, because that just, as soon as you said that, it was like light bulbs went off. So what were some of the traits of the ideal Christian athlete that they were trying to bring to the forefront of this campaign?
Yeah, so it would have been assumed white. So the mainline Protestants thought of themselves as more pluralistic, more broad-minded than evangelicals, but very much whiteness was still at the center of a lot of the way that they perceived themselves and understood their place in the world. But it's sort of a respectable, broad-minded, tolerant, ecumenical, clean living, character building. These were a lot of the ideas behind it. I think a figure who you might point to in the 1950s, it would have been people like an Otto Graham. He was the quarterback for the Cleveland Browns at the time. And, he's a sturdy Midwestern white Protestant. He's not going to try to convert you, but he will go out there and talk about how faith has helped him live clean and have firm convictions, and even maybe have some respect for his teammates of color. So they'll even talk about the sort of colorblind vision of racial inclusion, still centering whiteness, but again, I'm trying to allow some space for a more broad-minded view of American culture. It would have been someone like Branch Rickey. Branch Rickey was a founding member of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Branch Rickey, of course, was the general manager who signed Jackie Robinson to the Brooklyn Dodgers. And so again, had this approach to engagement with culture that, at least to some white Protestant peers, might have been more progressive, but still limited by sort of the constraints of a white-dominated religious perspective. And I think the last one I could mention is Bill Bradley. who's fascinating because he goes into politics. Bill Bradley eventually becomes, of course, a senator from New York, a Democratic senator. But in the early 1960s, Bill Bradley emerges from the Fellowship of Christian Athletes as like their vision of the perfect Christian athlete. He was really Tim Tebow before Tim Tebow. And I found there at the archives a video featuring Bill Bradley that was put out by the Presbyterian, I think it was the PCUSA church. They recorded a video of Bradley giving his testimony at an FCA event, which highlighted this collaboration of mainline Protestants with FCA at the time. And Bill Bradley, a young Bill Bradley, he's still in college at the time at Princeton, and he is sharing his testimony and talking about what it means to follow Christ. And so that young Bill Bradley, he's college educated, he's going to Princeton. So he has this image of respectability, but also sincerity. And he's talking in the video about, trying to give young people a vision for a positive future in the United States. And at the same time, having faith in God as an important part of that. What's interesting with Bill Bradley, though, is he eventually sort of moves away from the Christian athlete movement. So he finds in the tumult of the 1960s and the social revolutions, he ends up identifying more with the civil rights movement and with the protests that are happening. And he finds that there's not room for that within the Christian athlete movement. And so an argument that I was able to make and find in sources that were there at the Presbyterian Historical Society helped me show the ways that a mainline Protestant like Bill Bradley could enter into this Christian athlete space, but by the end of the 1960s doesn't feel at home there anymore. Feels like as Christian athletes like Bradley maybe push more for racial inclusion, they push more for civil rights activism, they're not welcomed. And so that idea of a broad-minded perspective that held sway in the 1950s, once it's challenged and once the authority, the sense of guardianship that mainline Protestants had was sort of directly challenged, there was sort of a backlash to that. And you could either choose to leave the Christian athlete movement, which is what Bill Bradley did, or if you wanted to stay within it, which evangelicals did more and more, it became more of a force for an individualistic conversion approach to the faith. So all of those things came to bear in terms of the ideal Christian athlete.
Whew, very insightful. Thank you, Paul. That was, I'm just intrigued by everyone's research topics. So it's really interesting hearing about what you found in the records of the NCC and how it all ties together. We love hearing about that and about everyone's processes. So thank you, Paul. We're gonna sort of switch it over and we're gonna come and ask Dee Dee a question about her research project. One of the questions, Dee Dee, that you looked to answer through your dissertation was how mission schools in Iraq inculcated gender norms and civic engagement into the minds of the students. Did you find evidence of this within your research? And if so, what was the relationship that you uncovered between the missionary educators and the Iraqi youth who were their pupils?
Yes, yeah, thank you for that question. It also helped me reflect on my ongoing research and argument that I'm still trying to make it more compelling right now. So yes, definitely I found some evidence of how mission school in Iraq inculcated these gender norms and civic participation in Iraqi students from various missionaries' reports on their educational work, especially in the United Mission in Iraq records, as well as a bunch of letters and journals written by American missionaries who taught in those mission schools, and students' yearbooks, which are like treasure that I found at the PHS. So I looked specifically at what these missionaries discussed about the nature of their curriculum and activities provided in their schools. I looked specifically on American School for Boys in Baghdad and Baghdad High School for Girls. So for example, what I found in the archive, especially related to American School for Boys, these missionaries offer Bible classes, of course, and also instruction on ethics and life talks given by missionary teachers. And also sometimes they brought guest speakers from the US to come to educate these Iraqi boys on how to become future leaders of the country. Sometimes teachers were encouraged to intermingle and interact with Iraqi students at the school and outside to provide some good role models or examples of how to lead moral and productive lives. And I also found that there was a student organization called the School Brotherhood, which aimed to cultivate a sense of fraternity and friendship among students who came from various social and cultural backgrounds. And I also find similar trend in Baghdad High School for girls that I look at, because women missionaries also sought to prepare these Iraqi girls for their future role in marriage and motherhood, whether through Bible lessons, home economics, and health education. At the same time, they also provide sports activities like basketball, volleyball for these Iraqi girls, and also they ran a student council with elections, which taught these girls lessons of teamwork, cooperation, and civic responsibility that these missionaries consider very significant for their students' lives as Iraqi citizens. So in terms of thinking about the relationships that I found between these educators and students, I think these missionary educators saw their duties as helping to alleviate intercommunal tensions and conflicts that they perceived in Iraqi society at the time. So they saw their student body, which consists of various religious and ethnic communities, as a microcosm of Iraqi society. So by bringing these different groups together, having them participated in communal activities like social clubs or sports or singing in choir, this missionary thought that this activity might help foster the spirit of cooperation and fellowship among Iraqi youths who would grow up to become future leaders of Iraqi society. Yeah.
Thank you, Dee Dee. That's very fascinating. It was a pleasure. I got to speak with Dee Dee when she visited in August, I think it was. She was in Philadelphia for the first time and looking through the archives, and we talked a little bit about her research project then, and just can't stop thinking about it. I'm always like wondering, I wonder what she's discovered this time. So very fascinating. Thank you for that answer. We're going to jump to Ruben. Ruben, one of your goals for your research project is to reframe the way Presbyterian mission work in the Belgian Congo is typically studied by examining how Africans' roles shaped the views of the American Presbyterian missionaries. How are the perspectives of the African communities found in an archive like PHS? And are there ways and methods to uncover those voices from within the missionary-centric documentation?
Well, thank you ever so much. Thank you for inviting me, and it was a pleasure to research in the Presbyterian Historical Society's archives. I think that finding the African voice is difficult. I think the Executive Committee of Foreign Missionaries was very totemic in the way that it writes and wrote its reportage. So finding the African voice is not easy, and particularly in certain periods other than others. So for example, once there is a very dense mission presence, and I research really what's central southern Congo in what's now Kasai, various Kasai provinces, in fact, in the Congo. This is an area that was very densely populated by a number of Presbyterian missionaries in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. And in that period of time, it's quite difficult to find the African voices because in a sense, these missionaries look at African people often as objects of conversion, or they're people who are recruited by the colonial states, but for labor projects. And these labor projects are often running counter to the mission projects, which are being operated by the American Presbyterian Congo Mission, which I'm very interested in. So what I found really is that African voices are in some ways telescoped, that they are very, very prevalent at the beginning of the mission encounter between the APCM and the Congolese. And very, very famously, they push the APCM into a confrontation with the administration of the Congo Free State. Now, it's very, very interesting that the pioneers of the APCM, William Shepherd and Samuel Lapsley, never had any intention of trying to take on Leopold. In fact, Lapsley was I actually met Leopold, very impressed with him. There was a great degree of cooperation. You couldn't really go to the Congo unless you had cooperation with Leopold to a great extent during the turn of the century. So there was a very tight relationship there for reasons I'm happy to go into in questions. But this, of course, breaks down as a result of African agency, that Kuba people are coming, principally Kuba people, which is one of the most sophisticated societies in Central Africa at the time, and Jan van Siener's explicated this in detail. And they come to mission stations run by the APCM, and they provide very embodied witness to the rubber atrocities which are happening at the turn of the century. So that pushes Shepherd, it pushes Lapsley, and later on it pushes William Morrison into a confrontation with the state. And that again is laid bare through all the trial documentation. And there's a lot of documentation about Shepherd, and this is all online actually, as well as in the PHS archives. Then going to the end of the story, there's a lot at the end. And this is where you start to have pastors who have been products of the education system of these various mission stations. And I chart in the book that I'm writing about how this really explodes in the 1910s and 20s, that you have a very, very wide-ranging network of APCM mission stations and what are called substations. So this is a very extensive network, and this does produce pastors who are trained and pastors who are Congolese. And of course, eventually the Congolese want independence from American oversight, and they want to form their own church. And I think one of the huge revelations actually of my time in the Presbyterian Historical Archives was in the finding of documents pertaining to decolonization and principally the formation of an independent Congolese Presbyterian church. And they have these very, very protracted negotiations with the Executive Committee of Foreign Missions. So you've got loads and loads of records pertaining to this very, very I wouldn't say tortured, but I'd say very complex handover. And that's, I think, something that really adds to the historiography, because we know a lot about the beginning and the Free State stuff that I've talked about. We know far less about the end, what happens towards the end, decolonization and the establishment of an independent Presbyterian Congolese church. And so those two moments are very, I think at the African Voice is very centered. In the middle, it's quite difficult because you have a lot of technical projects which are run chiefly from the executive committee of the various outstations and stations.
Again, fascinating answer. I find it very interesting that you have sort of the beginning and the end, and it's trying to figure out everything that happened in the middle and sort of digging it up, uncovering it within the archives. And that's a topic that, well, those are stories and narratives that we need to, bring into focus. So it's awesome work that you're doing. Connor. Oh yeah, of course, Ruben. Connor, your turn. In your research on what you termed main wave religion, you talk about how mainline and liberal religious leaders are often presented as simply a foil to conservative televangelists. What evidence did you find at PHS or elsewhere in your research that helped you prove that that is not the case?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question, McKenna. And my other panelists, just want to thank you all for being here. Thank the PHS for the fellowship, such good memories. And yeah, it's an honor to be here and to get to hear about the work of some other excellent scholars. That's been a fun part thus far, and looking forward to the rest of the conversation. So my work is about religion and radio, and then mass media, mass culture more broadly. So when you think religion and mass media, most folks, go to sort of a Billy Graham, a Pat Robertson. I am currently in Lynchburg, Virginia, so I'm, have to also acknowledge Jerry Falwell. Like there's sort of a clear, looming figures that we think of when we think of religion and mass media, and especially religion and broadcasting. And a lot of folks have sort of imagined it, as sort of that the history of religion or the history of religious broadcasting is basically a story of how evangelicals came to dominate the mass media, that is the story. And what I discovered in materials at the Presbyterian Historical Society, as well as elsewhere, is that actually it's a way more complicated story that hinges on how you define religious, sort of what is religious broadcasting. And so my project traces the history of how folks are defining religious broadcasting from the onset of sort of the creation of radio and its mass popularization in the 1920s, all the way up through the 1940s. And what I discovered was that actually there are liberals and centrists, Protestants, Jews, Catholics, that play more of a role and have more of an impact than they're generally given credit. So again, the sort of evangelicals, the folks like Jerry Falwell or some others are really on the outside of national networks until the mid 1940s into the 1950s. But when we think about the golden age of radio, when we think about the War of the Worlds broadcast in 1938 by Orson Welles, where they think they're Martians, or FDR's radio side chats, that actually the folks that are in the driver's seat are a lot of these liberals and centrists, almost always, the vast majority of whom were white, cis white men, liberals and centrists. And so one of the things, so I discovered a lot of really great material at the PHS archive, everything from sort of correspondence between radio broadcasters like Ralph Washington Sockman, a Methodist minister who was on NBC's national radio pulpit for decades, the longest running program at the time for several decades. And you would get one of the cool things that I saw at the archive were these letters from listeners. So you're able to get a sense for who's tuning in, how they're experiencing that. And you're seeing the ways that listeners are often listening across denominational and creedal lines. Another find at the archive is you have I looked at a lot of materials related to the Federal Council of Churches. And so there's, for instance, a letter from the NBC, the National Broadcasting Corporation, to so the president of NBC, Owen D. Young, to Charles McFarland, the general secretary of the Federal Council of Churches, where basically Young is like, hey, we want religion on NBC. We're a new network, and y'all can organize that. And you can see, sort of looking at the sources, where McFarland underlines, every time that Owen D. Young mentioned the national element of the national broadcasting, programs of national importance, national programs, like this idea of the nation was really, really important. And so what I ended up discovering was how pre the sort of rise of Graham and others, you really have a I'll scratch my back, you scratch yours dynamic between national radio networks like NBC and CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System, who, what are they getting out of it? They're getting, helping gain new listeners who tune in every week. There's always an ad right after these religious programs, but you're also getting, pastors like Harry Emerson Fosdick, who then goes before the Federal Communications Commission, the other FCC, and is talking about how great sort of NBC is. And then meanwhile, for folks like Fosdick and his colleagues, it allows them to claim the nation that says, actually, this spectrum of folks, like this is one, what religion is, but this is also like trying to say that we are American religion. We are the nation's church. And so you really see with the radio sort of the way that religion and power are playing out and having major long-term effects that go well beyond sort of the golden age of radio as well.
That kind of answers the second half of the question, which is how has your research sort of brought to light the impact of main wave media on the history of the communications industry? I'm not sure if you have anything else you want to say to that point.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say as far as on the history of the communications industry, is it plays a major and yet totally underappreciated role. You know, take a look at the debates over the 1934 Communications Act, and these folks that are, you know, getting free airtime on CBS and NBC really end up derailing efforts to have a different type of communication system. So they herald in a communication system which is dominated by private commercial companies selling things, even though many of them, that's how they described why they got into the process in general, of like trying to redeem mass culture. You know, they get into the radio and these national networks and in this attempt to redeem mass culture, and yet accidentally end up sort of enshrining mass culture, sanctifying these national networks and the advertisers that they were bringing into people's homes all across the nation.
And once again, a fascinating answer. I grew up listening to radio stations like the Joy FM and other things like that. So very interesting for me to hear of the larger history of all of that. So thank you, Connor. We're going to move into our next question for everyone. This is a more general question. How did the fellowship offered by PHS impact your ability to conduct your research for your project? And why, in your opinion, is it important to visit in archives in person during your research? And we'll just move backwards. So Connor, I'll just come back to you. That's okay.
Great. Yeah. Well, I will say I was one of the scholars, one of the fellows who got the award and was all excited to go. And then that did not happen for much longer than I was hoping for. So I will start by saying, actually, you know, I was a graduate student at the time and living on a graduate student stipend. It wouldn't have been possible without the fellowship. And so I am so appreciative. And I know so many other grad students are, you know, when you're barely making enough to make ends meet, it just makes a huge difference. So actually in the first about year and a half of being a fellow, I primarily used my funds for scans. And that was so important because I really needed that material as soon as I could at that sort of stage where I couldn't wait until I could do the research in person. And so those scans, you know, I was able to look at, you know, get scans, for instance, of the Donald Barnhouse papers. So this is an outsider, someone who was on CBS, but gets kicked off in 1931 when CBS is like, we want to get rid of Charles Coughlin, sort of Catholic priest who ends up becoming like a major anti-Semite. And they're like, we want to kick off Coughlin and all the other sort of non-liberal centrist, non-sort of main wave pastors. And so I was able through those scans to look through Barnhouse's papers and sort of get a sense of what CBS is saying, which is so crucial because there is no CBS archive. Whereas there is an archive for NBC, there's no archive for CBS. And so through the Barnhouse papers, I was able to sort of take a look at that. Thankfully, however, I was not subject just to scans and was eventually able to visit the archive. And that's, I mean, it's just so good for being able to meet folks, to talk with staff members who often have great ideas that, you know, I hadn't even thought of or hadn't thought to look in X, Y, or Z folder or box. And yeah, and finally, just the fact that, you know, sometimes being a historian, going through an archive, you end up you end up opening up a folder and you think to yourself, oh, this is not what I need. And then you put it back and then you move on to the next one. That is something that when you're taking a scan, you can never get. And so it just allows you to use your time so wisely. So yeah, so as well as just Philadelphia is a great city and the PHS staff is wonderful. So it was just a delight to be there.
Thank you, Connor. We're glad you were able to, after a long period of waiting. Thank you for your patience as we, you know, struggled through that year and a half that you couldn't come visit, but we're glad you were finally able to come see us in person. Ruben, how about you take the floor?
Thank you ever so much. And just to repeat really what Connor said, in the sense of tremendous gratitude to be able to go, in terms of the impact with my research, I don't think I could have done my research without a PHS fellowship. I'm tremendously grateful because the documentation that you have is tremendous. And I think you have a lot of things online, and it's very, very admirable how much you have online. And I talked about William Shepherd's papers earlier, and that is all digitized now. And there's so many archives related to the APCM that it'll be, I mean, you could spend years digitizing them, I guess. And so I needed to go to see these physically. Most of these files aren't available digitally. So being there physically meant that I could see them. And also seconding what Connor said about the expertise of the staff. I mean, I really am so grateful for all staff for answering all my questions really I had, because I'm somebody who's spent a lot of time with Catholic mission archives. My last book was on Catholics in the Congo, and I didn't really know very much about Presbyterian. So every so often I'd ask a question, what's this and who's this? And I'd ask kind of questions, technical questions, theological questions, and it was great to be able to talk to people. And I could never really have done that sitting alone with my computer with a scanner or what have you. So that was very, very important. Echoing again, sorry, I'm just echoing what Connor said here, but Philadelphia is a wonderful city. I really had a lot of fun in Philadelphia. I always do. So that was tremendous as well. So overall, it was really good. But I mean, absolutely importantly, I just couldn't do my research without it. I mean, it really was such a tremendous resource that I'm ever so grateful. So thank you very much indeed.
And we at PHS are also immensely grateful for all of you, and we're just excited that you guys, you know, find these things useful in our archives and that these records are being put to good use. And it's just really fun. It's fun. We're very nerdy at PHS, I guess, but that's what brings us all together. So Didi, we'll bring it off to you for how the research fellowship impacted your research.
Yeah, speaking of the nerdy, yeah, so I'm one there. So I was a fellow in the midst of, I'm not so sure if we're still in the middle of the pandemic period last August, but I enjoy my time in Philly and I returned to DC safe and sound. So that was fortunate for me. And yeah, so the fellowship definitely helps me make tremendous progress in my archival research on missionary education, as the vast material at the PHS would definitely form a major part of my dissertation chapter on Presbyterian Mission School in Iraq. And the fellowship allowed me to make a trip to Philly for 3 weeks. So that's a very long time, yeah. And for me personally, visiting an archive in person is very important. Like, I can cite like 2 main reasons. Like, first, it really allows me to make archival connections, which mean by following a research trail, by making connections between the materials that I found in different boxes that I chose to look at the PHS, and also relating what I found from the PHS with other relevant documents that I found in other libraries in the US. So in other words, when you actually be there on site at the archive, you go through each box and folder chronologically. Sometimes you will get a sense of a narrative that the archive is trying to convey to you, and it prompts you to come up with your own perspective and questions towards it. And sometimes it can be helpful to let the archive guide you through the story instead of coming up with your own questions and trying to look for an answer in the archives. That's just my personal opinion. So in my case, visiting an archive pushed me to explore and situate the Presbyterian archive in a larger historical framework, be there American Christianity, global education, or cross-cultural interactions. So, and sometimes you may find something that you didn't expect to see in the archival box or mystery box just by looking at the online finding aids alone. So I really appreciate the fellowship that I received here. So thank you.
I love that, the archive, let the archive guide you. And also just, you know, the surprises that you find. I know you talked about the yearbooks that you found that you were so excited about. You had no idea they were there. We love finding little secret surprises in the archive. Thank you, Dee Dee. Paul, it's your turn to answer our question.
Yeah, I would echo what three others have said. I think for me, what gets me excited about being a historian is getting to go to archives, and there's a sense of yeah, like it's a gift. Sort of there's a sense of responsibility to know that people have stewarded this and have spent, you know, time protecting and guarding this historical record. And so to be able to continue to find ways to tell that story, to explain how the past is shaping the present, I think that really is a privilege. And so to participate in that on it's almost selfish to say, but I love that just as a historian to get to do that exploration. Also, as a grad student, I was living in Texas. Without a fellowship, I would not have been able to go to Philadelphia and to do the research that I was able to do, to pursue those questions. And you know, digitization is, of course, there's some great things with that, but there is no replacement for going and spending sustained time in an archive. You'll get the broader context for what you're looking for. So you'll find you're not just targeting one particular you know, phrase that you might search for with digitized sources, but instead you're getting a world that you're immersing yourself in. And I think that broadens your understanding of what was really going on at the time, which is what we should be about as historians. It can lead you to consider new possibilities. And then, of course, the archivists are always going to have something more for you, a question you hadn't considered, a source that you didn't realize had something there for you. I know I found that was the case for me in the week that I spent there. So I think it's just essential to doing the work of a historian. And I'm really thankful that I had time to go there in Philadelphia and be a part of it.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul, and everyone else for your wonderful answers to all of our questions today. That wraps up our portion of the questions for our panelists. So we have a little bit of time for some audience questions. So far we have just one that I will read out right now. This one is for Paul in particular. An anonymous attendee was wondering, where does the YMCA fit into your research, into your discussion on the Christian ideal and those Christian organizations?
Yeah, it is the precursor to a lot of the material that I talk about and look at. So the YMCA was central to forming or popularizing a movement that scholars called muscular Christianity, which linked together religion and masculinity and sports. And the YMCA was a really important part of that. By about the 1920s and 1930s, the YMCA is really doing less with sponsoring high-level sports teams, and they're more about recreation and fitness and health for all. And my project was really looking at the sports industry as it developed. And once you started to have specialized coaches and athletes, what happens then? And so the YMCA had really gotten out of that business by the 1920s. It wasn't doing much of that. And so it didn't have much of a role to play in the specific sports industries that I was looking at, but it absolutely helped to frame the ideology. It helped to popularize the links between religion and nation and race and masculinity that other folks later on that I studied looked at. So I would say it was an important precursor.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul, for answering that audience question for us. It looks like we do not have any other ones. If they do pop up, we have a few minutes left on our webinar session. So
can I ask Connor a question?
Yeah,
okay.
Of course.
Connor, your projects, I mean, all of the projects fascinate me, but this one overlaps with some of my own areas that I'm interested in. So I was wondering just about if you're seeing some similarities with how you're approaching this idea of radio. And I'm thinking of a scholar like Matthew Hedstrom, who's looking at books or other forms of popular culture and liberal religion. I think that topic is so needed and so interesting. So I'm just wondering if you've made some of those connections and if you kind of build on some of that scholarship.
Yeah. When you were describing your project, I was like, oh yeah, like there's definitely some overlap here of this like somewhat slightly like trying to be pluralistic and like to a degree a little more pluralistic, and yet like also within what I would call, since it's my topic, a spectrum. But yeah, so there's such great scholarship out there on religion and media right now. So Matthew Hedstrom writes about religion and print and sort of the rise, what he calls the rise of liberal religion. And a lot of these folks, they're similar folks. So he writes about Harry Merson Fosdick. Well, Fosdick was also on the radio every single week on NBC doing National Vespers. So they're in broader media worlds. Media scholars often end up writing about, I write about TV, I write about radio, I write about print, just as a way to try to, you gotta draw a line somewhere, but they're operating in broader sort of media worlds. So you end up having, for instance, a lot of the folks that I study, and one of the huge advantages of being on a national network is that then you're really likely to be in a bunch of you're likely to be in a bunch of newspapers. So for instance, S. Parks Cadman, who is often considered sort of the, father of NBC's religious radio programs, a congregational minister, he had a syndicated column that was like in hundreds of newspapers across the country. And what was that column? It was like taking part of what he was saying in his weekly address and literally just like, their form of the 1930s, 1920s form of copy and paste. So they're happening in these sort of broader worlds. But I think what's unique about radio as opposed to print is that radio has a defined spectrum. Like there's only so many people who can be sort of on the radio at one time. Whereas sort of with print, it's sort of this philosophy of, they talk about like, oh, well, cream will rise to the top. But with radio, it's like, oh no, this is about power and who has the power to get on the spectrum. Because, if, someone in South Jersey is trying to be on the same radio wavelength as someone in Philadelphia, there's going to be clashing and it's going to sound terrible. And so that's where sort of the state comes in and plays a much bigger role than in print or in some of these other works. But yeah, lots of great scholars who I was definitely building on their wonderful work.
Thanks for that. I will be looking out for your work. That sounds fascinating.
Well, that was incredible. We love scholars supporting scholars. Past PHS fellows supporting PHS fellows. We love to see it. That wraps up about the time that we have for the audience / panelist questions. I am going to turn it over to Lucy, our Director of Development, to talk a little bit real fast about Giving Tuesday, which is a campaign that really is vital for the support of our research fellowship program, which was able to fund all of these amazing people's visits to the archives. So Lucy.
Thank you, McKenna. And I want to thank all the presenters. Wow, you've done some wonderful research, and I am so grateful for the work that you've done, your contribution to PHS, and the fact that we were able to support you all. And so kudos to you. And sort of McKenna has already talked about Giving Tuesday, but it's an opportunity really for the donors that Nancy talked about early on to support us and to help us make these fellowships available to researchers. So on November the 29th, which is only a couple of Tuesdays from now, it's Giving Tuesday, and we're asking all the audiences on all the platforms that are watching today to consider making a donation so that we can help researchers in the future by providing grants to them. So mark your calendars. Go to our website on the 29th, follow the links for Giving Tuesday, and make a donation. The size doesn't matter at all. And I am really happy to say that we already have a Leech Challenge gift of $5,000. So for every donation that's made up to $5,000, it'll be matched. So we're already ahead of the game, and we want to be able to have a year from now other researchers come and talk about how their projects were supported by PHS and the wonderful contributions that you're making, not only to our denomination, but to our archives and to the world, really. So thank you all.
Thank you, Lucy. And just a final note is that I'm leaving some links in the chat here on Zoom about our information about the Research Fellowship Program, as well as our Giving Tuesday page. If you head over to the Giving Tuesday page, we highlight a lot of very kind words from past fellows, and we redirect you to the Research Fellowship page, and you can check out our lists of past fellows and what they worked on while they were here at PHS. And yeah, I thank each and every one of you, the panelists who agreed to participate tonight. This has been really incredible. I've had a great time. I hope you all have as well. And thank you to everyone tuning in.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good night, everyone.